Late September 1944. Somewhere near the French-Belgian frontier, morning mist clung to the ground as a column of exhausted German prisoners of war shuffled slowly along a dusty road. Their uniforms were stained with mud. Their boots were worn thin after weeks of retreat. Many had not eaten a proper meal in days. Most had seen their tanks abandoned, not because they had been destroyed, but because their fuel tanks had run dry. Then the road curved. Beyond a line of camouflage nets stretched a sight so immense that even the guards noticed the prisoners slowing their pace. Row after row of steel fuel drums disappeared toward the horizon. Thousands of them. Tanker trucks rolled in every direction without pause. Pipelines snaked across open fields. Bulldozers leveled new storage areas while engineers worked as if this endless sea of gasoline was simply another day's routine. For men who had spent months calculating every remaining liter of fuel before moving a single vehicle, the scale was almost impossible to comprehend. Some prisoners later admitted that this was the moment they understood something far more devastating than the loss of a battle. Germany was not merely fighting Allied armies. It was fighting an industrial machine capable of delivering oceans of fuel across an entire continent. And as these silent witnesses stared across mountains of gasoline, the true story of how logistics became one of America's greatest weapons in the Second World War was only beginning. The story of those towering fuel dumps did not begin in France. It had been unfolding for years, long before the first American soldier set foot on the beaches of Normandy. To understand why the sight left so many German prisoners stunned into silence, it is necessary to go back to the foundations of modern warfare itself, because by the middle of the Second World War, fuel had become as essential to an army as ammunition or food. When Germany invaded Poland on September 1, 1939, the world witnessed a new style of warfare. Fast-moving columns of tanks, motorized infantry, artillery tractors, and aircraft struck with a speed that shocked military planners across Europe. The campaign became closely associated with what later came to be known as Blitzkrieg. Yet behind every kilometer advanced by a panzer division stood thousands of liters of gasoline, diesel, and aviation fuel. Every tank that crossed a river, every truck carrying ammunition, and every fighter aircraft climbing into the sky depended upon an uninterrupted flow of petroleum. Germany entered the war with a dangerous weakness that its leaders understood all too well. Unlike the United States or the Soviet Union, it possessed only limited natural oil reserves. Much of the Reich's fuel came from synthetic fuel plants that converted coal into liquid fuel through complex industrial processes. These facilities represented remarkable engineering achievements, but they were expensive to operate, difficult to expand, and vulnerable to sustained bombing. Germany also relied heavily on oil imported from Romania, particularly from the rich oil fields around Ploiești, which became one of the most strategically important energy sources for the Axis war effort. During the early years of the war, rapid victories concealed this weakness. Campaigns in Poland, Denmark, Norway, the Low Countries, and France were relatively short. Fuel stocks, though carefully managed, proved sufficient for these swift operations. German victories created an image of unstoppable efficiency, but beneath that image logisticians constantly measured consumption rates, transportation capacity, and available reserves. Every successful offensive consumed vast quantities of fuel that could not easily be replaced. The invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941 transformed the scale of the problem. The distances across the Eastern Front dwarfed anything the German army had previously experienced. Roads were often little more than dirt tracks that turned into deep mud after rain. Trucks burned enormous amounts of fuel hauling supplies across hundreds of kilometers. Tanks required constant refueling simply to reach the battlefield. Aircraft supporting advancing ground forces demanded thousands of additional tons of aviation gasoline every day. As the campaign dragged on, the German supply system began to strain under impossible demands. Rail networks had to be converted to different track gauges. Vehicles wore out faster than factories could replace them. Fuel convoys became longer, slower, and increasingly vulnerable to Soviet attacks. Every additional kilometer gained by frontline units stretched supply lines even farther behind them. German planners recognized that oil had become one of the decisive resources of the entire conflict. This realization partly drove the 1942 offensive toward the Caucasus, where some of the Soviet Union's largest oil fields were located. Capturing those fields promised not only relief for Germany's growing shortages but also the denial of critical resources to the Soviet war machine. Yet the offensive ultimately stalled, culminating in the catastrophic defeat at Stalingrad. The oil fields remained beyond German reach, and the fuel crisis only deepened. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Atlantic, a very different story was unfolding. The United States possessed immense petroleum reserves, a vast refining industry, and an industrial economy capable of producing fuel on a scale unmatched by any other nation. American oil fields in Texas, Oklahoma, California, and elsewhere supplied an almost unimaginable flow of crude oil. Refineries transformed it into gasoline, diesel, aviation fuel, lubricants, and countless other products needed to sustain modern armies. Even before American troops entered combat in large numbers, factories were working around the clock. New pipelines crossed the country. Tank cars carried fuel to coastal ports. Tankers crossed the Atlantic despite the constant threat posed by German U-boats. Engineers, dockworkers, refinery employees, railroad crews, and merchant sailors became just as vital to victory as infantrymen carrying rifles. The United States did not simply manufacture weapons. It built the means to keep those weapons moving day after day, month after month, across oceans and continents. That industrial foundation would eventually allow American armies to operate with a level of mobility that many of their enemies found almost impossible to imagine. And nowhere would that contrast become more visible than after the liberation of Western Europe, where an entire logistical empire began to rise behind the advancing Allied front. By the summer of 1944, that logistical empire was finally put to the test. June 6, 1944. Normandy. When Allied forces landed on the beaches of France, they faced a problem almost as difficult as defeating the German army: how to supply millions of men, thousands of tanks, artillery pieces, trucks, and aircraft across a devastated continent. Every shell fired, every vehicle moved, and every aircraft sortie depended on fuel. In the weeks after D-Day, engineers built artificial harbors known as mulberries to unload supplies directly onto the French coast. Beaches became vast supply zones crowded with vehicles, fuel containers, ammunition stacks, and construction equipment. Yet the real challenge began when Allied armies broke out of Normandy and started racing across France. General George S. Patton's Third Army advanced with extraordinary speed during August 1944. American armored columns sometimes moved faster than the supply system could keep up. Tanks, trucks, and half-tracks consumed fuel at astonishing rates. A single armored division could require hundreds of thousands of liters of fuel during major operations. As Allied forces pushed eastward, supply depots had to be moved farther from the beaches and closer to the front. To meet this demand, the Allies created one of the most famous transportation networks of the war, the Red Ball Express. Beginning in August 1944, thousands of trucks operated almost continuously between Normandy supply bases and frontline armies. Drivers traveled day and night, often sleeping only a few hours before returning to the road. Many were African American soldiers serving in segregated transportation units, and their contribution became indispensable to the Allied advance. At its peak, the Red Ball Express moved thousands of tons of supplies every day, much of it fuel. Long convoys stretched across French roads carrying gasoline in jerrycans, tanker trucks, and trailers. Dust filled the air. Engines overheated. Tires wore out. Yet the trucks kept moving because an advancing army that ran out of fuel could become helpless within hours. Another remarkable project unfolded beneath the English Channel. Engineers developed PLUTO, pipeline under the ocean, a system designed to pump fuel directly from Britain to the European mainland. Although it did not solve every supply problem, it represented an extraordinary attempt to create a continuous fuel artery feeding the Allied armies in France. As ports such as Cherbourg and later Antwerp became available, the flow of supplies increased dramatically. Fuel depots appeared across liberated France and Belgium. Some covered enormous areas, hidden under camouflage nets and protected by anti-aircraft defenses. Mountains of steel drums stood beside rows of tanker trucks. Pipelines connected storage sites to transportation hubs. Railroad tank cars arrived in endless succession. The scale was difficult to comprehend. By late 1944, Allied forces in Western Europe were consuming millions of gallons of fuel every day. The American Army alone operated vast numbers of tanks, trucks, jeeps, artillery tractors, engineering vehicles, and aircraft. Keeping them moving required a logistical effort larger than the entire economy of many nations. German soldiers increasingly encountered a painful contrast. Their own units often faced severe shortages. Tanks were rationed. Training flights were reduced. Vehicles were abandoned during retreats. Captured fuel became a prized objective. Meanwhile, Allied convoys seemed endless. For many German prisoners, the shock came not from seeing American weapons but from seeing the fuel that fed them. A destroyed tank could be replaced eventually. A grounded army without fuel could not fight at all. And as Allied fuel dumps expanded across Western Europe, they became more than supply depots. They became visible proof that the balance of the war had shifted decisively toward a nation capable of sustaining industrial warfare on a scale few had ever imagined. The first impression many German prisoners carried into captivity was not one of defeat on the battlefield, but of abundance beyond anything they had experienced during the war. For years, fuel had been measured in precious liters. Every convoy commander calculated consumption before moving. Every tank commander knew that an unnecessary detour could leave his vehicle stranded. By late 1944, shortages had become a constant companion. Entire armored formations were ordered to conserve fuel, while trucks waited motionless because there was simply nothing left to pour into their tanks. The contrast with the American Army was almost impossible to ignore. Prisoners watched long columns of trucks arrive at fuel depots without interruption. Tankers rolled in from ports, unloaded their cargo, and departed to collect more. Bulldozers expanded storage areas while engineers laid additional pipelines. Fuel drums stood stacked in orderly rows that stretched farther than the eye could comfortably measure. For soldiers accustomed to scarcity, it seemed less like a military installation and more like an industrial city devoted entirely to gasoline. Many German officers had entered the war believing that tactical brilliance could compensate for material disadvantages. Blitzkrieg had reinforced that confidence. Speed, surprise, and concentrated force had defeated larger armies in the early years of the conflict. But by 1944, reality had changed. Even the finest tactical plan depended upon an uninterrupted supply of fuel. Without it, tanks became stationary bunkers, trucks became obstacles on the roadside, and aircraft remained silent on their airfields. This realization affected morale as much as logistics. Captured German soldiers could now see with their own eyes that the Allies possessed not only superior numbers of vehicles but also the means to keep every one of them moving. It was a sobering lesson. No matter how determined a unit remained, courage alone could not overcome an opponent whose supply system operated with relentless consistency. Behind that consistency stood one of the most complex logistical organizations ever assembled. The United States Army Quartermaster Corps, supported by engineers, transportation units, petroleum specialists, and thousands of civilian workers, transformed fuel into a carefully managed flow rather than a static stockpile. Every gallon was tracked from refinery to port, from tanker ship to storage depot, from pipeline to fuel truck, and finally, into the engines of tanks, trucks, aircraft, and generators at the front. Planning reached far beyond the battlefield. Supply officers estimated future operations weeks in advance, calculating expected consumption for entire armies. Engineers constructed storage facilities before frontline units even arrived. Roads were repaired to support heavy tanker traffic. Damaged bridges were replaced with temporary structures capable of carrying fully loaded fuel convoys. Railroad crews restored captured rail lines to speed deliveries deeper into France and Belgium. To an outside observer, these activities lacked the drama of combat. There were no dramatic charges or artillery barrages. Yet every successful offensive rested upon this invisible network. The men driving fuel trucks often worked under enemy air attack, navigated roads crowded with military traffic, and endured long hours with little recognition. Their mission rarely appeared in headlines, but its importance was impossible to exaggerate. For German prisoners standing beside those immense fuel reserves, the conclusion became increasingly difficult to escape. They were not simply observing piles of gasoline. They were witnessing the physical foundation of Allied military power, an industrial system capable of feeding armies across an ocean and sustaining them across an entire continent. And while the fuel itself represented overwhelming material strength, the methods used to transport and protect it revealed another dimension of American advantage that would shape the final months of the war. The technology behind those enormous fuel reserves was rarely celebrated, yet it quietly transformed the way the Allies fought the war. Every container, every pipeline, and every transport vehicle had been designed with one purpose in mind: to move fuel safely, quickly, and efficiently across thousands of kilometers. Unlike dramatic new weapons that captured newspaper headlines, these innovations worked in silence, but their impact reached every battlefield in Western Europe. One of the simplest and most effective inventions was the jerrycan. Originally developed in Germany during the 1930s, its robust steel construction, secure locking cap, and three-handle design made it ideal for military use. The Allies quickly recognized its superiority and produced millions of similar containers throughout the war. Soldiers could carry them by hand, stack them inside trucks, or load them onto tanks. They reduced fuel loss, resisted damage, and allowed supplies to move rapidly even where pipelines or tankers could not reach. What appeared to be an ordinary fuel became one of the essential tools of mechanized warfare. Pipelines offered another remarkable advantage. Rather than relying entirely on trucks, engineers built networks that delivered fuel directly from ports to inland storage depots. Combined with projects such as PLUTO, these systems reduced road congestion and ensured a continuous flow of gasoline to advancing armies. Every kilometer of pipeline removed hundreds of truck journeys, allowing transport units to focus on supplying the rapidly moving front lines. American fuel trucks were equally important. Built for reliability and standardized maintenance, they could travel long distances carrying thousands of liters of gasoline. If one vehicle broke down, replacement parts were readily available. Mechanics could repair damaged trucks quickly because the American industrial system emphasized interchangeable components and mass production. This standardization minimized downtime and kept convoys moving almost without interruption. The same philosophy extended to leadership. General Dwight D. Eisenhower understood that modern warfare depended upon logistics as much as battlefield tactics. His headquarters treated fuel as a strategic resource, carefully balancing the needs of different army groups. Commanders such as Omar Bradley and George S. Patton often requested additional fuel to maintain momentum, but those requests had to be weighed against the requirements of neighboring formations. Decisions about where gasoline would be delivered could determine which army advanced first and which one temporarily paused. Patton, famous for his aggressive style of warfare, frequently expressed frustration when fuel shortages slowed his advance. Yet even he acknowledged that an armored army without gasoline was powerless. His rapid offensives depended entirely upon the transportation units working far behind the front. Every spectacular breakthrough celebrated by historians rested upon countless hours of planning by officers whose names rarely appeared in history books. For the German High Command, these realities became increasingly alarming. Intelligence reports described growing Allied supply capacity, but reports on paper could not fully convey the psychological impact experienced by soldiers who saw the depots firsthand. Captured prisoners often realized that they were facing more than superior tactics or larger armies. They were confronting an opponent whose industrial output seemed virtually inexhaustible. This realization spread beyond individual prisoners. German commanders understood that every destroyed Allied truck could be replaced, every empty fuel dump could be refilled, and every offensive could resume once supplies caught up. Germany, by contrast, struggled to replace lost vehicles, repair bombed refineries, and secure enough fuel even for defensive operations. The imbalance had become structural rather than temporary. By the closing months of 1944, that imbalance would shape one of the most decisive campaigns of the war. Germany's final major offensive in the West would begin with ambitious plans, experienced troops, and powerful armored formations, but it would also carry a fatal weakness that no battlefield courage could overcome. Fuel, once again, would decide the outcome before the last shot was fired. December 1944. Winter settled heavily across the forests and rolling hills of the Ardennes. Snow covered narrow roads, while freezing fog concealed entire columns of vehicles from the air. To many German soldiers preparing for what would become the Battle of the Bulge, the offensive represented one final opportunity to reverse the course of the war in Western Europe. The plan was bold. German armored formations would smash through the thinly held American lines, cross the Meuse River, capture the vital port of Antwerp, and divide the Allied armies. On paper, it carried echoes of the lightning victories that had stunned Europe in 1940. In reality, the offensive rested upon a resource Germany no longer possessed in abundance: fuel. Every tank commander understood the problem before the first engine started. Panzer divisions were issued just enough gasoline to begin the attack. The plan depended on capturing Allied fuel depots as the advance unfolded. Without those supplies, many formations would simply run out of fuel before reaching their objectives. It was a strategy born not from confidence, but from desperation. During the opening days of the offensive, German forces achieved complete tactical surprise. On December 16, 1944, artillery shattered the quiet morning across the Ardennes. Infantry moved through dense forests while panthers and tigers pushed along icy roads. Several American units were overwhelmed, and gaps appeared in the Allied defensive line. For a brief moment, it seemed as though Germany had rediscovered the speed and momentum that had once defined its early campaigns. Yet beneath every successful advance lay the same invisible question: how much fuel remained? Tank crews often carried additional jerrycans strapped to their vehicles, hoping to extend their operational range. Fuel trucks struggled to navigate roads clogged with armor, artillery, horse-drawn wagons, civilian refugees, and damaged vehicles. Mechanical breakdowns became increasingly common in the bitter cold. Every delay consumed precious gasoline without advancing the offensive. Meanwhile, only a short distance behind the Allied front, American logistical networks continued to function. Engineers repaired damaged roads almost as quickly as they were destroyed. Transportation units rerouted convoys around blocked routes. Fuel depots dispersed their reserves to reduce the risk of catastrophic losses. Even when German attacks disrupted local supply lines, the broader system remained intact. Captured German soldiers soon found themselves transported through areas they had hoped to seize. There, many witnessed scenes unlike anything they had experienced during years of war. Entire fields were filled with neatly stacked fuel drums arranged in endless rows beneath camouflage nets. Tanker trucks arrived one after another, unloading their cargo with practiced efficiency. Portable pumps transferred gasoline into storage tanks while pipelines quietly fed new supplies from the rear. Railroad sidings were crowded with tank cars waiting to be unloaded. Everywhere there was movement, organization, and seemingly limitless reserve. For men whose own divisions had entered battle counting every remaining leader, the contrast was almost surreal. Several post-war accounts from German veterans described their astonishment at the scale of American logistics. While individual memories naturally differed, a common theme emerged repeatedly. The quantity of fuel available to the Allies appeared almost unimaginable. Many realized that what they had believed to be isolated supply depots were only small parts of a much larger network extending from Atlantic ports across France and into Belgium. The realization carried profound psychological weight. Destroying a handful of fuel trucks could no longer change the balance of the campaign. Capturing one depot would not cripple Allied operations because others stood ready farther behind the lines. American logistics had developed depth as well as scale. It absorbed losses, adapted to changing conditions, and continued feeding armies that stretched across hundreds of kilometers. For German commanders, this posed an impossible challenge. Their offensive required speed, but traffic congestion slowed movement. It required surprise, but delays gave American forces time to reorganize. Above all, it required fuel that simply did not exist in sufficient quantities. As the days passed, abandoned German vehicles began appearing along frozen roads, not always because they had been destroyed in combat, but because their fuel tanks were empty. Crews drained gasoline from damaged vehicles to keep a few others moving. Some tanks were left behind intact, their engines silent, while exhausted soldiers continued on foot through the snow. The offensive had begun with hope. But hidden beneath every kilometer of advance was a logistical countdown that could not be stopped. And as Allied forces regrouped for their counterattack, Germany's final gamble would soon collide with the overwhelming industrial power that those silent fuel dumps had represented all along. The failure of the Ardennes offensive marked more than the collapse of Germany's final major attack in the West. It exposed a reality that could no longer be hidden from soldiers, commanders, or civilians alike. The German army had not simply lost momentum, it had lost the ability to sustain modern mechanized warfare. As January 1945 unfolded, Allied forces resumed their advance across Western Europe. American, British, Canadian, and other Allied formations steadily pushed eastward toward the Rhine River. Behind every armored column came an immense logistical network that had grown even stronger since the Normandy landings. Supply depots expanded, railways were repaired, bridges were rebuilt, and fuel convoys continued moving day and night. For the average Allied soldier, the system became almost routine. Tank crews expected to refuel before every major operation. Truck drivers reported to designated fuel points where pumps and storage tanks were already waiting. Mechanics repaired damaged vehicles with replacement parts delivered through the same supply chain. Generators powered field hospitals, radio stations, and headquarters without interruption because fuel remained available. Few paused to consider how extraordinary this had become. Only months earlier, these same armies had fought their way onto the beaches of Normandy with supplies carried across the English Channel. Now they operated hundreds of kilometers inside Germany's western frontier while consuming millions of gallons of fuel every week. It was one of the greatest logistical achievements in military history. The German army experienced the opposite reality. Retreat became increasingly difficult because there was often insufficient fuel to move heavy equipment. Commanders faced impossible choices. Should the remaining gasoline be given to tanks, artillery tractors, ambulances, or supply trucks? Every decision meant another vehicle would be left behind. Across Belgium, Luxembourg, Western Germany, and the Netherlands, abandoned vehicles became familiar sights. Panthers, Tigers, half-tracks, trucks, and self-propelled guns stood beside frozen roads with little visible battle damage. Many had been destroyed by Allied aircraft or artillery, but countless others had simply exhausted their fuel supplies. Their crews removed machine guns, destroyed radios, and, whenever possible, disabled engines before retreating on foot. For Allied troops advancing through these areas, the contrast was striking. Roads that had once carried powerful German armored columns were now lined with silent machines that would never fight again. The Luftwaffe suffered an even greater crisis. Germany still possessed skilled pilots and capable aircraft, including the advanced Messerschmitt Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter. Yet these technological achievements could not overcome the fuel shortage. Training flights were drastically reduced. Experienced pilots flew fewer missions. Newly trained aviators often entered combat with far less flying experience than their Allied counterparts because aviation fuel had become so scarce. An advanced aircraft without fuel was no more useful than a grounded truck. The same applied to Germany's navy. Surface ships remained confined to port, while submarine operations became increasingly restricted as petroleum supplies dwindled. Every branch of the German military felt the consequences of the nation's collapsing fuel economy. Meanwhile, Allied intelligence officers carefully studied captured German documents, interrogated prisoners, and examined abandoned equipment. Their reports consistently revealed the growing severity of Germany's logistical crisis. Fuel shortages appeared repeatedly in operational orders, maintenance records, and prisoner interviews. It became increasingly clear that many German formations were no longer limited by their willingness to fight but by their ability to move. The prisoners themselves often provided some of the clearest testimony. Many recalled receiving only small fuel allocations before operations. Others described long marches because transport vehicles had no gasoline. Tank crews spoke of carefully calculating every kilometer traveled, knowing there would be no additional supplies if they misjudged consumption. Some remembered abandoning perfectly serviceable vehicles simply because no fuel remained to operate them. These accounts reinforced what Allied commanders had already begun to understand. Industrial production, transportation, and logistics had become weapons every bit as decisive as tanks, aircraft, or artillery. The ability to refine petroleum, transport it safely across oceans, distribute it efficiently through Europe, and deliver it precisely where needed had fundamentally shaped the outcome of the campaign. As Allied armies crossed the Rhine in the spring of 1945 and drove deeper into Germany, the importance of that logistical advantage would become even more evident. The final collapse of the Third Reich was now approaching, and the consequences of its fuel crisis would leave a lasting mark on military history. As Allied forces advanced beyond the Rhine in March 1945, organized German resistance began to fragment across much of the front. Individual units continued to fight with determination, and in many places the battles remained fierce. But the strategic picture had changed beyond recovery. Germany's industrial base had been devastated by years of bombing, its transportation network was collapsing, and the fuel that once powered its armies had become one of the rarest commodities in the Reich. American supply columns, meanwhile, continued their steady march east. Engineers repaired damaged bridges within hours or days. Railway battalions restored captured lines so trains loaded with fuel and ammunition could continue moving toward the front. Petroleum distribution companies established new depots almost as quickly as old ones were left behind. Tanker trucks arrived in carefully scheduled convoys, ensuring that advancing divisions rarely remained idle for long. The system had become a self-sustaining machine. Every successful advance opened new roads. Every repaired bridge increased the flow of supplies. Every captured rail junction strengthened the next offensive. The speed of the Allied advance in the final months of the war was not simply a result of battlefield victories. It reflected an extraordinary logistical organization that had matured over years of planning, industrial production, and operational experience. Historians have often described logistics as the unseen foundation of military power, and the campaign in Western Europe remains one of its clearest examples. During the war, the United States produced hundreds of millions of barrels of petroleum products while operating one of the world's largest refining industries. Combined with Britain's transportation network and the contributions of other Allied nations, this industrial capacity ensured that fuel remained available even during periods of intense combat. Germany fought under entirely different conditions. By 1945, repeated Allied bombing campaigns had severely damaged synthetic fuel plants that converted coal into gasoline. Oil production from Romania, once Germany's most important external source of petroleum, had been lost after Romania changed sides in August 1944. Railways transporting fuel were repeatedly attacked from the air. Storage depots became frequent targets. Even when fuel could be produced, moving it safely to frontline units became increasingly difficult. Military analysts after the war reached a broad conclusion that has been echoed in countless staff colleges and defense academies around the world. Strategy cannot succeed without logistics. Brilliant commanders, advanced weapons, and courageous soldiers all depend upon a continuous flow of supplies. When that flow breaks, operational freedom disappears. This lesson influenced military planning long after the guns of the Second World War fell silent. Modern armed forces place enormous emphasis on fuel distribution, transportation networks, maintenance systems, and supply resilience. Contemporary armies understand that protecting logistics is just as important as protecting combat units. Advances in technology have changed the appearance of warfare, but the fundamental principle remains remarkably similar to that witnessed by those German prisoners in 1944. An army moves only as far as its fuel allows. Looking back, the image remains striking. A line of weary prisoners, many of whom had spent months rationing every liter of gasoline, suddenly confronted an American fuel depot stretching toward the horizon. Endless rows of drums, tanker trucks arriving without pause, pipelines feeding storage tanks, soldiers working with calm efficiency, treating what seemed impossible as an ordinary day's routine. For those prisoners, the sight represented more than American wealth or industrial strength. It represented certainty. It meant that the Allied armies could continue advancing tomorrow, and the day after that, and the day after that again. The war in Europe would officially end on May 8, 1945, but for many German soldiers, the outcome had become unmistakable long before the final surrender. In quiet moments beside roads, rail yards, and sprawling fuel dumps, they had already seen the true balance of power. Not in the roar of a tank's cannon, not in the scream of a fighter aircraft, but in the endless flow of fuel that kept an entire army moving. The Second World War is often remembered through its great battles, famous generals, and legendary machines. Images of Tiger tanks, B-17 bombers, Sherman columns, and infantry advancing through shattered cities have become symbols of the conflict. Yet beneath every dramatic photograph lay a quieter story, one measured not in explosions, but in gallons of fuel, miles of pipeline, and thousands of supply trucks traveling roads few historians ever place at the center of the narrative. The German prisoners who stood before America's immense fuel dumps witnessed something that could not be captured by battlefield tactics alone. They saw an industrial system operating with extraordinary scale and consistency. It was a reminder that modern war is not won solely by the courage of those on the front line, but also by the countless engineers, refinery workers, truck drivers, mechanics, railway crews, dock workers, and logisticians whose work rarely appears in history books. Their efforts transformed petroleum into mobility. Mobility became momentum, and momentum became victory. Germany entered the war with experienced soldiers, innovative weapons, and commanders capable of remarkable operational achievements. But as the conflict grew into a global industrial struggle, the ability to replace losses and sustain armies became just as important as battlefield skill. Every abandoned tank beside a frozen road, every grounded aircraft waiting for fuel, and every silent engine told the same story. A machine built for war cannot fight when its fuel runs dry. That is why the endless rows of American fuel drums left such a lasting impression on so many captured German soldiers. They represented more than gasoline stored in steel containers. They symbolized an economic strength that could cross oceans, overcome enormous logistical challenges, and sustain millions of Allied troops until the final victory in Europe. History often celebrates the battles that changed the course of the war. But sometimes, the outcome is decided long before the first shot is fired. Sometimes, it is decided in the silent movement of supply convoys through the night, in pipelines stretching beneath fields and seas, and in the unseen determination of those who ensure that an army will never stop moving. Because in the end, the greatest weapon on the battlefield is not always the one that fires the loudest. Sometimes, it is the one that keeps every other weapon alive.